Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Eris Williams-Reed. Thank you very much for tuning in to my little presentation on the Golden Age of Aretas, the Casna in Petra, as part of the Warwick Classics Network and Leventis Ancient World Study Day. I'm recording this on a very wet and windy afternoon from my home in Newcastle upon Tyne. So let's get started and go to the beautiful city of Petra, which is a lot more warm and beautiful than the view that I have at the moment today. So the title of my presentation takes its inspiration from the so-called Golden Age of Augustus. This year I've been teaching one of our modules at Warwick called The Transformation of Roman Society in the Age of Augustus. And my own research focuses on the communities who lived on the so-called edges of the Roman Empire. And so I was very interested to bring this area of my own personal research interests to the study of the Augustan age. When we think about the age of Augustus and we think about the Golden Age, we might conjure images of, for instance, this statue here, the so-called Via Labicana Augustus, which depicts him as a priest. A big part of the rhetoric of the Augustan age is Augustus as a moral saviour who is ushering in this golden age of Rome, in which we see this flourishing of visual art and culture, and also poetry and architecture, and it really becomes this pinnacle of Roman culture at this time. What I'm particularly interested in, though, is recognising that the ancient world in and around the Mediterranean at this time was home to many other empires, kingdoms and communities. And indeed, many of these places were undertaking their own golden age in a way that was very much detached from what was going on in the centre of the new Roman Empire in Rome itself. One particular kingdom that I'm interested in is that of the Nabateans, and this was a kingdom that had been in existence for quite some time before Augustus came to power. And during the Augustan age, it was primarily ruled by a king called Aretas IV. You can see here on this slide in this coin that I've included. A lot of our understanding about the Nabateans and Aretas in particular is obscured by the fact that when we're thinking about these communities in an Augustan context, we're looking at them through a Roman filter. Aretas is therefore often obscured by his presumed relationship to Augustus. This is underscored by, for instance, accounts that we have in Josephus, somebody who's writing a little bit after these events, who claims that Augustus is angry when Aretas assumes his throne in the Nabatean kingdom because he hasn't written to ask him for permission. And apparently Aretas, in order to address this, sends gifts and a gold crown and many envoys to Augustus to basically smooth over this process. We have no idea if this actually happened, if this is actually the relationship and the dynamic between these two figures. But indeed what we can tell is that Aretas was a figure who was very independent and that he ruled from his capital city in Petra, a very multicultural kingdom that was very much engaged and participating in this real rapid period of cultural transformation across the Mediterranean in a way that didn't show any kind of subservience to Rome at this time. The site of Petra, as some people might know, is located in modern-day Jordan, and I've circled where it is on this map that you can see on the left. So it's very much in the heart of what we might call the modern-day Middle East. The site of Petra is famous for the colour of its beautiful red sandstone, which you get a taste of in this image here on the right. It's also famous for its rock-cut tombs, which you can hopefully see in this photo. So these are beautiful, really quite magnificent buildings that are carved directly from the rock face. And indeed, if you ever get the chance to go and visit Petra, this is something that is very striking about the site. Although there are many freestanding buildings, most of the site is actually carved from the rock face in really beautiful detail and very personal detail as well. Often when you're walking around the site, you can see small shrines dedicated to very personal gods that have been carved by people from many, many centuries past. Where Aretas comes into this picture then, into this city, is, as I've said, he was the king of the Nabateans, and this is the capital city of that kingdom, Petra. He reigned between 9 BC and AD 40. And during his reign, we start to see a real flourishing, some people might say, indeed a flowering of Nabatean culture in Petra itself. We see this with rock-cut architecture, an example of which we'll look at in a moment, but also with many freestanding buildings as well. So what you can see on the slide here is a structure that's often known in scholarship as the Great Temple. And we gather that it began its life as a temple, as a religious building, but it seems in its later history it also became an audience chamber, a reception hall for the king, in which he dealt with various delegates from the kingdom. And what I want to emphasise here is that this building is something that may have been in existence before the reign of Aretas, but he really expanded it and developed it and really sort of incorporated lots of different kinds of architectural influences, including those that were distinctive to Nabatea. The reason why I'm mentioning this is because people who've perhaps studied the Augustan age before might think about the Forum of Augustus as this public and religious and political space that really becomes a showpiece for, in that context, Augustus as the man in charge of Rome. And I think we should really try and see quite a similar parallel here with this building that Aretas is constructing. And for people who are wondering, yes, the size of it is actually comparable to the Forum of Augustus, such is the grandeur and magnificence of this structure. As I've said, though, one of the main things that you notice when you go to Petra is its rock-cut architecture. And so this is a building that I want to focus on today in my talk. This is something, particularly if you're looking at the image on the left of the screen, this is a building, a structure that you might already know a little bit about. You might recognise this from the film Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. This is the place that they visit at the climax of the film. Although this building has very little to do with that context in Indiana Jones, I think the film does a really fantastic job of capturing how impactful the approach to this monument is. As you can see on the left screen, you approach it through a very narrow gorge, and you get little tantalizing glimpses of this structure as you're walking through, between these rock faces. And there's a real emphasis on the way that the light amplifies this structure that you're approaching. Once you come out of this narrow gorge, you're then immediately faced with the view that you see in the image on the right. You see the full detail of this magnificent structure, which is carved from the rock face. And I just want to draw your attention with the photo on the right to the people at the bottom of this image, just to give you a real sense of the scale of this building. The human figures that we see on here are over life size. This is a really spectacular and imposing structure. When we look at the Kasne, when we're looking at it and thinking, what is this building? A lot of people often think that it's a temple, and especially they think that it's a classical temple. And that's due to this unique combination of different architectural details that you can see in a little bit more detail here on this slide. So we have, for instance, starting from the bottom of the image, we have these columns that are topped with Corinthian capitals, something that we see in the classical temples of the Greek and Roman worlds all over the Mediterranean and further afield. We then have this pediment, which is decorated with lots of vegetal designs, something that at this sort of period in time is quite similar to the kind of details that we see on monuments like the Areopagos. Moving up the image, we then although sadly quite faded now, have these images of different gods and goddesses in the different niches. In the very centre we have the goddess Isis, known from ancient Egypt, holding a cornucopia on her left hip. And then finally at the top of this image we have this broken pediment, and the central niche in between this pediment is known as a tholos. And this is something that we then see in classical art in many different parts of the ancient world. At this time we see it in places like Pompeii in wall painting, but it can also be traced back to Alexandria and Hellenistic architecture of that period. So we can look at an image like this and perhaps instinctively, if we're people who are looking at this with some experience or some interest of the study of the classical world, we can often be guilty of looking at images like this through classical eyes, of being drawn to details that feel comfortable or familiar, that feel classical, that feel like, gives us some kind of understanding here as to what this building is and to what it means. But even if we just focus for a moment on the meaning of the building, despite the fact that this looks very much like a classical temple, it is in fact a tomb. And it's not a particularly classical tomb, it's actually something that is highly Nabatean. And this is due to two factors. Firstly, this is due to the fact that this was a tomb most likely built by Aretas, and it was built for his two wives, Huldu and Shakela, and then it seems it also became his final resting place as well. The second factor is, if you can see in the rock face either side of the tomb, we've got these little footholes here. It's very easy when we see these classical details to lose sight of the fact that this is actually a rock-cut monument, and these footholes bear witness to the way in which people did this. They actually started at the top of this rock face and then carved their way down in painstaking detail. So for a Nabatean looking at this, yes, there might be all of these classical multicultural influences, but the very form of this tomb is something that is distinctively Nabatean. So even just a brief discussion of thinking about who used this tomb and how was it made cautions us against viewing this with classical eyes, of just immediately thinking that this is some kind of classical monument and then possibly running away with ourselves and thinking, well, this is an indication that Aretas in the age of Augustus was taking cultural cues from Rome at the centre of the Roman Empire. And I want to say a little bit that then expands that theme by focusing on just one particular detail of this tomb in order to demonstrate that these are the kinds of buildings that can actually embody multiple different cultural meanings, and we shouldn't just be viewing this in a one-dimensional fashion. So the element of the tomb that I want to focus on then are these eagles. So if you look at the photo on the left of the screen, hopefully you can see where these eagles were located. There were two on each halves of these broken pediments in the upper register of the tomb. The photos on the right of the slide give you a bit more of an idea of what these eagles looked like on their pediments. Unfortunately, we don't have the complete eagle left here, but you get a sense of their wings and these beautiful feathered legs. I often feel like they're wearing sort of fluffy trousers almost. They're really gorgeous. And especially, the size of these are over life-size eagles. If you look at the image on the left, notice the size in comparison to some of the human figures, the gods, in that upper register. And you can see, therefore, that these eagles are important. These are very central figures, possibly even divine figures, which is a point that I'll get to shortly. So how do we interpret the inclusion of the eagles on the casne? When we see eagles, again, if we're thinking with a Roman or a classical mindset, then we might think about Jupiter or Zeus. And specifically in the Augustan context, we might think of an eagle as that being seen atop of the legionary standards used by the Roman army. If we're thinking about a very particular context at this time in history, we might also be reminded of the central detail of the Prima Porta breastplate, this statue of Augustus that some people might be familiar with, which depicts here the Parthian king returning the standards to this unknown Roman on the left around 20 BC following successful negotiations by Augustus. So we might see an eagle on the casne and think, is that a symbol of some sort of alliance with Rome, perhaps? But the eagle is actually a symbol that has a very long and complex history. On the right on this slide, we have a coin of Ptolemy I, which was minted in Alexandria. And on the reverse, we can see an image of, dare I say, in this case, quite a grumpy looking eagle. But this image, which goes all the way back to Greece and is connected here to the reign of Alexander, is a symbol that means something completely different to what we see in the image on the right. It's still associated with the main male god of the pantheon in question, but there's already some different political meanings attached to it. And we might even also want to ask ourselves, well, why are we looking west? Why are we looking to Greece and Rome for an understanding of what these eagles might mean on the casne? Because in fact, much closer to home in this area of what we might refer to as the Near East, the eagle was a symbol that had been in circulation and in development for many, many centuries beforehand. Here's one of many examples that I could pick of eagles in the art of the Near East, particularly the religious art. So this is a lintel from the temple of Baal Shamin in Palmyra, a city located in modern-day Syria, where we actually see multiple images of eagles, and they're often seen to be representations of local gods, such as Baal Shamin here, and also Baal as well. So we can trace some similarities in a way between the use of the eagle to represent Zeus in the Greek world, to represent Jupiter in the Roman world, and then in this case to represent Baal Shamin in the Near East. But how is Aretas using this eagle? Because even though we can see it's connected to this local Near Eastern context, and perhaps not a Greek or a Roman one, we don't want to fall into the mistake of just assuming that Aretas is passively consuming all of these different cultural factors. We should take into account the possibility, indeed the likelihood, that Aretas is using an eagle in a way that is distinctively Nabatean. And indeed, we have evidence of this from the kingdom itself. So what we have here is a coin of Aretas issued in Petra around 1 or 2 AD, so just a few years after the likely date in which the casne was constructed. And Aretas, in fact, is following very much in the footsteps of his predecessors. There's actually a long history of eagles being included on Nabatean coins, and especially they're not really being used as a way of referencing allegiance to Rome or the Ptolemies or the Parthians, the other major superpower in the East. In fact, Aretas's predecessor, his immediate predecessor, Augustus II, issued coins very similar to the one you see on the slide that featured an eagle with a legend in Nabatean Aramaic that read, "The blessing of Doshares, Augustus, king of the Nabateans." Doshares was actually the main god in the Nabatean religious tradition. He is perhaps, we might roughly say, equivalent with somebody like Zeus or Jupiter or Baal Shamin. And so what we therefore see here, and what we should appreciate when we're thinking about the inclusion of, for instance, the eagles on the casne, is not to try and understand these symbols with reference to other far-flung and distant cultures, but actually we should try and appreciate these symbols in their own local terms and in their own right. In recent years, there's been a shift in scholarship towards appreciating the culture of the golden age of Augustus as being kind of deliberately full of ambiguities, or even being one of polysemy, something that has multiple meanings in quite a purposeful way. And we should really try to be doing the same with the kinds of communities and kingdoms and indeed empires that also inhabit the ancient world in, around and beyond the Mediterranean at this time as well. Thank you very much for listening, everybody. I hope you enjoyed this mini lecture. I've included my email address on the very first slide of this presentation, so if you would like to ask me any questions about it, then I would love it if you got in touch with me. Thank you very much, and I hope you have a nice day.